So tonight we're going to we're going to use sort of a relatively straightforward question to maybe open the can of worms a little bit on questions of historic renovations and sort of the differences in sort of approaches to the changing of our built environment. And then we'll open up a little bit more about maybe tax credits and a few other things. But tonight's question: a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preserving rural heritage hires an architect to renovate an 18th century farmhouse to its original form. The foundation gives tours in period dress and aims to make the farmhouse a field trip destination for elementary school children. Since it was originally built, it's seen two 20th century additions. Which best describes the renovations classification? So why don't you guys use that chat box down there to number one, number two, number three, or four. One, preservation; two, rehabilitation; three, restoration; four, reconstruction. The answer to this one is three, restoration. And we'll talk about that, sort of why that is the case. For those that might care, the building in front of you, this is a Smithfield plantation house here on the campus of Virginia Tech, just outside the central campus. The smaller building to the back on the left is the Fraction family cabin. The Fraction family was an enslaved family during the original sort of ownership of the building pre-Civil War. And it's sort of a joint site now that's being used to interpret histories in lots of different ways. And is a good example of this sort of restoration. So I think for the sake of the AREs and taking tests, you should probably just go ahead and memorize these four terms: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Because they sound somewhat similar and they have some overlapping concerns, it can be maybe a little easy to accidentally confuse some of them. So we'll walk through sort of the definitions, where those come from, the origin of these terms, how this is sort of developed over the last 75 to 100 years. And then we'll look at a few sort of examples of things. And then we'll close out the evening with three or four of my favorite sort of renovation adaptive reuse projects for 40 seconds of architecture, which will probably be 12 minutes of architecture. First, let's go through a bit of context. So if you don't know sort of about these kinds of projects, there's some familiar players you should get to know. The question of sort of renovation of historic properties is actually overseen by the National Park Service, which is within the umbrella of the Department of the Interior. And this has been the case since these conversations started in the 1930s. For those that don't know, I do a lot of adaptive reuse projects over the years, a lot of mixed use renovations, housing combined with business and cultural things in sort of mid-Atlantic, mostly in Virginia cities. So this world of sort of modifying and amending and adapting our built environment is sort of near and dear. So we'll probably go a little bit deeper on some things that are probably beyond the scope of the ARE tonight, but maybe they'll be useful to you as you guys do some of these things. I love that it's required that you have a buffalo on anything related to the interior or the National Park Service. So we'll jump in the way back, or the not so way back machine, and sort of this first conversation about sort of preservation and architectural heritage started in 1933 and then really kicked into gear in 1934 when the Library of Congress, our trade group, the American Institute of Architects, and the National Park Service combined together to create the Historic American Building Survey, or HABS for short. You might have seen sort of that shorthand of, hey, have you looked at that HABS? If you don't know what HABS are, go to the Library of Congress's website and just start Googling, because it's a wonderful wealth of resources for exceptional buildings from American history. And this can be the sort of elaborate kind that you see in the drawing shown here. And it can be sort of exceptionally important buildings like the small cabin in that brochure that's on the left. And this is a program that's still ongoing. You can go to the Library of Congress's website right now and sort of get the rules if you were conducting a HAB survey of how you'd make the documents and how you photograph things and how you keep track of information. So they're wonderful, sort of beautifully drawn. They usually have site plan, floor plan, elevations, details, things like that. And they're wonderful. So this sort of started in the 30s as a way to recognize that maybe we need to be a little bit careful with some of our built heritage. Then you sort of fast forward 30 years. That's not to say nothing was done. Harry Truman passed and they passed some legislation in the 50s, but it got real serious in the 1960s. And those who know a little bit of history and your Jane Jacobs will know about sort of Penn Station and the sort of movement after that was torn down that sort of created maybe historic preservation as we know it today in architecture. In New York, and then sort of expanding out from there. I did a lot of work in Richmond, and it was similar, sort of late 60s, early 70s, when historic preservation was really sort of entering the scene. And it was a direct response to sort of the removal of maybe really important buildings that had cultural, architectural, or other sort of value. And specifically, it was kind of a broadside against urban renewal, which was basically like, we're going to wipe out things, and we're going to largely do that in minority communities, and we're going to level, whole parts of cities to build interstates. So it was a kind of a reaction against that. And Lyndon Johnson commissioned a report, which is that with Heritage So Rich report that sort of put forth a bunch of findings that basically found, hey, a bunch of those Habs buildings we measured over the last 30 years, about half of those have already been demolished. So it really started this preservation movement in earnest. And in 1966, they passed sort of the National Historic Preservation Act, which basically provided money and resources and stated categorically that it's the government's sort of interest and responsibility to help preserve some of these things. And then you can sort of, over the next, let's say 50 odd years, a series of guidelines have been released, consistently edited and updated by the Department of the Interior, sort of adding, clarifying sort of the standards that were written, adding more, adjusting things, constantly responding. These things come out every 10 years or so. They've increasingly sort of gotten smarter. So there's guidelines related to sustainability for rehabbing buildings. There's a new set that just came out, I think, last year related to flood proofing with sort of climate change and rising sea levels, specifically related to architectural heritage and flood proofing. And then sort of the ones we're going to focus in on tonight, which is the source of the answer to our question, which is kind of the, the Secretary standards and guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing. The current version of these are from 2017. There's 2 giant PDF files that we're going to sort of go through tonight. So here's our 4 terms. So this is the sort of origin of the answers or the options to this question, of which restoration was the answer for our particular example this evening. So let's do what we do and go through these things. And all of these are text and images I've pulled straight from the preservation guidelines. So this is an easy resource for you to go and pull up if you want to dig a little bit deeper. If you've worked on some of these projects, you're probably a little more familiar. So these may be a little bit easier for you on the test. If you've done mostly new construction, or you haven't had the chance to sort of work on sort of older buildings or do renovations or negotiate these things, this might be new content. So you might want to familiarize yourself a little bit with it. So preservation, and I've sort of taken the tiny text and blown up the important part, is defined as the active process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. And over the last decades, it used to be they talked about buildings. Increasingly, they talk more about sites and context. So they've broadened the scope a little bit, that it's not just kind of the object of the building, that it might mean the whole property. Could be a garden is contributing, could be other things. And there's actually a set of guidelines related to preserving landscapes as well. So preservation, I would say, is one of the more sort of limited ones. So the appropriate treatment when the objective of the project is to retain the building as it currently exists. So this is doing the least amount of modification and changes. Certain sort of repairs are allowed, but the goal is to sort of hold on to all the existing materials and features. And it might also include sort of anything that was added on later on is also maintained. So it's really about whatever the extant work is that's in front of you, that building, with whether it has a 20-year-old addition or 200-year-old addition, is sort of preserving all of those things in a more or less intact form. And then the guidelines sort of go through descriptions of what that means with regards to paint and metal and shutters and all that kind of good stuff. So we can see why this one doesn't work for our question, because, it talks about removing, sort of returning the building to its original state and removing 20th century additions. So we can eliminate this one as an option for our test tonight, for the question tonight. The preservation is pretty limited. Think about when you go to pick your favorite sort of president from Virginia, their old house, it's sort of trying to preserve as much original sort of material, maintaining things kind of as they are, doing the least amount possible to sort of keep things standing. Mount Vernon, Monticello, that kind of stuff. So the second category is rehabilitation. Right? It's defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alteration, and addition, while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. So in rehabilitation, historic building materials and character defining features, we're going to hear that term a few times tonight. Kind of keep it in the back of your mind, are protected and maintained as if they were sort of being treated in a preservation way. However, greater latitude is given to replace extensively damaged, deteriorated, or missing features. Of the four, only rehabilitation allows alterations in the construction of a new addition, if necessary, for continued or new use for the historic building. So this one is maybe gives you the most latitude. So if preservation is one of the more restrictive of the four, rehabilitation is the more expansive. And I would say we throw around a lot of other terms that sound like these four. Adaptive reuse gets used a lot. Renovations, repair, those kinds of things. Most of those are going to fall under rehabilitation. So most of the work I've done, I would say when I say I do adaptive reuse, it's a lot of rehabilitation. We're sort of trying to preserve certain things. We're making select modifications and additions to the building in order to meet whatever the new desired use of the building is, to bring it up to code compliance, to turn it into apartments from an old warehouse, to do whatever we're attempting to do. And that's not to say that when you're doing rehabilitation, you're not also doing some preservation. So for example, I've shared a project down in Danville I worked on, and it's adaptive reuse and rehabilitation, no doubt. But we restored existing windows kind of in place, took them out, stripped them down, repaired the wood, repainted, put the glass back in and put it back up. So that's a sort of a preservation or a restorative act. So you can see how these things, while the definitions are sometimes fairly straightforward, there can be a lot of overlaps. And in fact, when we look at beautiful architecture towards the end of the session, you'll see that maybe the best projects do all of these things at once, at least in my opinion. So the third category, restoration, which is the answer to tonight's question, which was about a school that had some additions where they want to host themed historic reenactments. So restoration is defined as the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. So this restoration period, we're going to also talk about a little bit shortly as being maybe the period of significance, which is a sort of specific term that gets used a lot in this space. So restoration is about sort of peeling back things that weren't originally part of the building or from the most important period of significance, and making sort of select repairs in order to sort of put those things back. And it's important, it's sort of trying to put those things back. Usually we know what they are. We're not kind of making it up. We have photographic evidence or drawing evidence, or trying to match a shutter, and there's another shutter on the building. So it's really about sort of putting things kind of back in a way where as opposed to maybe a reconstruction, which is kind of what we do when we're not quite sure of things. So restoration is a treatment that should be followed when the express goal of the project is to make the building appear as it did at a particular and its most significant time in history. Unlike other treatments in which most, if not all, the historic elements are retained, restoration will likely include the removal of features from other periods. So back to our question, it specifically talked about removing 20th century non-original construction. Non-original is a term that gets used a lot in these kinds of projects to differentiate sort of things that are allowed to be removed or demoed as opposed to sort of original or historic elements. So it's really about sort of putting something back in a sort of museum kind of way of a snapshot in history, as opposed to rehabilitation, which is more of a sort of ongoing dialogue between maybe the past and the future, or between what was old and what is new. And then the fourth, it's arguably sort of used the least, is reconstruction. The process of depicting by means of new construction the form, features, and detailing of a non-surviving site, landscape, building, structure, or object for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time and in its historic location. So this is a reconstruction of a church that was lost and sort of rebuilt to as if it were original, but it's sort of rebuilt, replaced in kind, we would say. It's different from the other treatments in that it is undertaken when there are often no visible historic materials extant, or perhaps only a foundation. It involves recreating a historic building, which appears as it did at a particular and, of course, most significant time in history. It's frequently the least undertaken, and it should only be considered when there's really accurate documentation. So reconstruction is not a speculative act. It's not a guess necessarily. We can make interesting artistic interventions that might sort of interpret what a building might be when we don't know what might have been there, or all we have is a foundation. But it's reconstruction is, let's say there were a set of drawings, or, from a photographic age where we can sort of recreate things in kind. So reconstruction is fairly limited. And actually the requirements of the Department of the Interior standards state that you have to basically put signs on it that say, this is not old, it is in fact new. It's it's been built and reconstructed. So it's basically not trying to hide anything, but it's making it very, very clear that this was sort of new thing that was made based on an old thing. So those are our four: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And the sort of language of the Department of Interior standards can be a bit dense in things. So here's maybe just some shorter versions. So preservation, I've got an old bank. I'm going to keep the bank a bank and preserve all that old character kind of exactly as it's found. Rehabilitation, I'm going to take that old bank and change it into something new, into a tech startup. And that might mean making additions, changing some of the interior, preserving certain things, but it's more sort of aggressive in its approach to changing the nature of the building. Restoration, I'm going to return the bank back to its old glory by getting rid of all those old additions that were stuck on the back in the 1920s. And then reconstruction, well, the bank had burned down in the fire. I'm going to rebuild it exactly the same as what it had been before the fire. These things might seem a little kind of esoteric or unimportant, but then, in 2019, Notre Dame burned and sort of a debate ensued about what do we put back? Do we put it back? Do we put back the tower? The tower wasn't actually original. It was added by Viollet-le-Duc, and there's sort of lots of debates. And this is something that goes back pretty far. You can find sort of art historians in Italy 50 or 60 or 70 years ago writing about the Campanile in Venice being replaced, when it sort of burned down. So preservation,
completely collapsed.
Preserve the old character. Rehab, turn it into something new. Think adaptive reuse. Restoration, get rid of the old stuff. Get rid of the non-original things. Keep and restore all the original things. Reconstruction, it's gone. Put it back like it was. All right. So I'd like to maybe shift this conversation a little bit beyond maybe the sort of limited, straightforward scope of the things you might experience on the ARE, like our question we started with, and maybe just to expand a little bit on how these things you might be experiencing them in practice. And I see there's already some good questions sort of coming up in the chat from some experience. So I look forward to some discussion. I think in practice, most of the time you might have to deal with these National Park Service, Department of the Interior, Secretary of the Interior standards. If you're going to sort of be working on some really old building that's listed and protected on a national, state, or even local register, where you kind of have to even if you wanted to make aggressive changes, you might be limited. So you have to work within the standards. And then the one that, at least for me, has been more common, and we see a lot, especially in some of our older cities where we have older buildings, like on the East Coast, is sort of by leveraging tax incentives, tax credits to make projects financially viable. A number of years ago, the statutes were sort of amended and added on to those original 1966 Act has been updated over the years. And they specifically added, like, if you want grant money, if you want these tax incentives, you have to, in the statutes, the at the national level, and then subsequently the state level, and it required to sort of abide by and play ball with the rules of the Park Service in order to be eligible to receive the money. So working on old things where you're trying to get some money from the government to help you, right? It's sort of most of the time where these things come up. So history and money. All this stuff's readily available. Again, if these are sort of new things to you, you don't have a lot of experience, and maybe just go poke around a little bit on the National Park Service's website. Again, you probably don't need to go too deep on this for the AREs, but increasingly we're sort of renovating our built environment and not just building new. And there's climate reasons and energy reasons and sustainability and carbon and all those reasons why we should be doing more rehab and renovation work as opposed to new construction. So I'd sort of point you to those resources if you're interested in that. But, the National Register of Historic Places, lists parts of cities, lists particular buildings. You can apply for that status. And there's similar sort of at the state preservation level and sometimes occasionally locally as well. I think the one sort of that's where things get really, really interesting because it involves real dollars and cents, and there's a lot of incentives to pursue these programs, is through the historic preservation tax incentives, so-called tax credit programs, or the rehabilitation tax credits. You hear it sort of called all of these things. So if you're not familiar, this is a lot about sort of money. So these are programs that exist at the federal level and at many state levels to incentivize the renovation of the built environment, especially in older cities where sort of populations emptied out, industries moved. Think of sort of flight to the suburbs and all those things over the last 30 or 40 years. And now we're sort of making a return back to cities. So these programs are really about providing financial incentives for the renovation and preservation of our built environment, to take those old things sitting empty and maybe make it a little more financially palatable. So at the federal level, you can get up to 20% of qualified costs. So that's construction costs and a whole bunch of other things in tax credits back on a project. So imagine then for every dollar of costs, project costs that your client is incurring, 20% can be gotten through the tax credit program. So now they only have to come up with 80 cents for that instead of $1, and then if you add to that the state tax incentives, you're talking about real money on these things. So I live in Virginia and have done a lot of work there. So in Virginia, we this number is 25%. So if you combine federal and state level tax credits, you can get up to 45% of qualified costs back in tax incentives. So, what does that mean? That means your $1 million project, might get 200K of those expenses from federal taxpayers. So all of us at the federal level, 250K of sort of state taxpayers. So that's me and those of you living in Virginia. And then the clients and investors or wherever has to sort of come up with 550K. So you can see why these things are very, very desirable. You have to play by the rules. You have to be a good designer who can navigate some of the strictures of the program. It's a give and a take. You can propose, can we remove this and add that? So there's a lot of negotiation, a lot of sort of goodwill and navigating the system. You can't roll in sort of with a giant ego and get very far with these things. Interestingly, sort of our design fees are eligible expenses as part of a rehabilitation cost. So imagine then that, you're hired to do the work, you and your engineering team. Those fees can be are qualified expenses that can be reimbursed as part of through the tax credit program. So now maybe we have a financial incentive in these programs because it means we get to do the work because the clients call us. So there's something like $120 billion worth of tax credits that have been used since these programs started decades ago. And different states have higher or lower sort of usage of these programs related to their particular economic and regulatory environment. And then also kind of, do they have old buildings to work on? So a few other things. Again, most of these are sort of beyond the scope of the AREs, but if you do any work here, you're going to hear some of these things. So I thought it maybe be helpful to just kind of define some of these things for you. So the period of significance means in tax credit, historic preservation world, sort of the defining of, in let's say a building that's 120 years old, the sort of the period by which we will sort of agree that if we're going to restore things, that's the one. So it might be when the building's first built. It might be 30 years after it was built for some other reason. So it's about sort of clarifying that period of significance. I've worked on a lot of projects just sort of built in the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s, and they have something modified in the 1950s, and then we're allowed typically to remove those things if we so choose, because the period of significance is the early part when the building was built, not the 1950s. So, sort of understanding when we're talking about old buildings, what period of their life are we sort of looking at? Contributing elements or contributing resources, these are the things you have to save. That can be windows, it can be floors, it can be proportions of spaces, it can be historic staircases, it can be decorative cornices, it can be site features. So we talk about those elements that are the things that if we were to remove them, the historic or sort of cultural value might be lost. So those are the things that contribute to the historic value, and therefore we need to sort of save them or preserve them or sort of play very nicely with. So and every project will have slightly different contributing elements. So tax credit syndication, you hear this called sort of the tax credits are syndicated. Took me a little while to sort of figure out when I was first hearing this, 15 years ago. So most of us, let's say I wanted to renovate a building, I probably can't use $2 million in tax credits to pay off my income taxes because I'm not paying $2 million in income taxes. So this isn't free money that the government sends. It is a reduction of tax liability. So that example of $1 million with $200K worth of tax credits would mean somebody can defer $200K off of their taxes. Most of the time, that's not the developers or the building owners. They are in fact sort of selling the tax credits on an open exchange and market, and they're so-called through syndicators. So for example, you could go out and shop and big giant companies, Sherwin-Williams, for example. I specify Sherwin-Williams paint because the client says they're buying my tax credits. Please put their paint on the job. Sherwin-Williams, sort of large hedge fund. These kinds of folks are sort of they need more tax. They have a lot of tax liability. So they take and they go and buy tax credits, and they come in and they say to Mr. Developer or Miss Developer, I'll give you 88 cents on the dollar. So you give me $1 in tax credits I can use to defer my tax liability, which is on my $1 billion worth of paint sales. And I will give you 88 cents cash, right? So this is the way that sort of the developers trade tax credits, which have a value, but not necessarily financially to them specifically for, the liquid assets that help them renovate the building. And this is very, 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 very common. So they're, it's like taking a loan, they're paying sort of 10 or 12% to sort of get access to cash in order to do the projects. And then somebody else gets the tax credits and uses it. So it's perfectly legal. It's sort of typical, but it's a way of sort of moving the money around to allow for, the government's not handing checks to developers straight. They're giving tax incentives. And then there's sort of a market that connects folks who need those tax incentives who have cash to the folks who need cash to renovate buildings. So interesting kind of to think about. Blew my mind the first time someone explained, like, wait, these people are just buying this other stuff. So thanks for drawing, Dean. you'll hear sort of in tax credit, well, part one, part two, part three. Those are the parts of the application process. So the part one is a narrative. It's usually a page or two. It describes in kind of writing and maybe a photo or two the historic significance of the building. To get tax credits, it has to be registered on the National Register. It has to be a certified historic district. It can't just be a random building. Though I think from anything older than 1936, I think you can still use tax credits, whether it's in a historic district or not. But for the most part, all the projects I've worked on have been in historic districts. So the district gets certified. There's a number of buildings that contribute to that district. Clients come in and want to renovate them, and you use that. And this part one is grounded in historical research, sort of collecting of old newspapers or old photographs or sort of various resources. Clients or architects sometimes do spend time in the local library or the building department, sort of digging up, looking for evidence that the building sort of is of a certain time period and contributes in that way. So it's sort of a short narrative, and that has to be approved. The part two is maybe where those of you who've done this work can or plug in a little bit more. Part two is where before you do construction, usually with the architect's drawings, a set of drawings are used with a detailed description of what's being proposed to be changed in the building. So I'm gonna punch new holes in the wall. I'm gonna add a porch on the back. I'm gonna enclose a stair that wasn't enclosed. I'm gonna, remove the elevator that's missing. I'm going to, whatever you're gonna do. And those, it's usually elevation drawings, some details about windows, site plan, floor plans, existing conditions, and proposed. And those go through a multi-step review process at the state level first, and then at the national level in order to be reviewed and to then be in compliance. So it's before you do construction, you kind of got to get your design approved. And this is that kind of horse trading negotiation time where you might go back and forth a few times, make sure that the work you're going to do, everyone can move forward confidently, knowing that what you're proposing, when you come back and ask for the money at the end, they're not going to say, no, you did too much. You took out that thing I told you not to take out. So part one, short narrative. Part two, detailed design proposal and review. Part three is after the construction's done. So it's documentation. They send the sort of reviewers out to sort of go through the building and say, yes, you did the things you were supposed to do. And then you can apply for your tax credits. And then qualified reimbursement expenditure are those things that are allowed to be reimbursed. So construction costs, design fees, certain borrowing costs, there's a whole slew of those things. Importantly, most of the time in tax credits, renovations to the old building are covered, but if you want to add on, those are typically not a qualified reimbursement expenditure. So that's sort of coming out of your client's bottom line, not necessarily. So that's a way of protecting the taxpayers a little bit. Like, you're not adding square footage that somebody's going to lease and make a bunch of money on the taxpayer's dollar that's adjacent to the building or attached to the building. So it's tied to sort of those things that are fixed and attached to the historic part of the building. So just a few terms. Again, I'd be hard pressed to think you're going to see any of these really pop up on the ARE, but it might help to sort of fill in the gaps and clarify some of the differences between kind of how we do this type of work on old buildings. So I saw a few somewhere in the chat. Here's our question. So we'll circle back and then we'll have a little bit of discussion and we'll look at some buildings. So a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preserving rural heritage hired an architect to preserve this old farmhouse. They want to give period dress tours for school kids. Since it was originally built, there were two 20th century additions, which best describes the renovations classification. And as we've seen, sort of restoration best fits the bill. Restoration allows removal of non-original things. It more or less sort of preserves and keeps in place all the contributing important elements that make that building kind of what it is. No substantial change in use. You're not sort of drastically modifying the inside or the outside of the building. So restoration is our good answer tonight. Okay. I'll scroll back through, but maybe we can sort of open it up. Amberbook team, don't forget, take a chance and fill out that survey for us over in the chat while we're discussing things. But if folks want to unmute and we can talk a little bit about some of these things, or you can share your experiences of doing this kind of work.
We had a question earlier from the chat. A couple people had. I was just going to let you know about. So there was a question: how are partial works and projects described using this framework?
What do you mean by partial works?
So I think the idea is maybe there's a floor in a building that needs to be changed. James, Al, you want to maybe? I know you had one of the questions.
There's sort of a threshold dollar amount in some of these things that if it's more than, I think if it's more than $5,000 or something, then you can start to get into qualified sort of changes to things. If that's kind of like, is there money to sort of do facade repair or something like that? I imagine is kind of what we're getting at here. So I think there's kind of a cutoff somewhere in the weeds of those documents where sort of like every $100 thing you do doesn't count. But if a project there's a certain level of work and it gets to a certain dollar amount, it sort of starts to drift into the qualified territory. But the specifics of that, I'm a little less sure of. I've always worked on big giant projects, not the small ones.
We do have a hand raised. I'm gonna mess this up, but Den Kelly.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation today. When you go through the restoration and the reconstruction, I was wondering that do we have to file does it have to apply for what do you say ADA in these restoration and construction? Am I clear? Do you understand my question?
No, and it's an important one. And I would say questions of sustainability and energy often come up here too, because we've got a bunch of drafty old buildings with single panes and no insulation. And it's like, well, I'd love to be able to make that thermally perform a little bit better. So it's a question of like, what is the responsibility to bring things up to closer to contemporary codes, whether that's accessibility or thermal
accessibility.
Yeah. So I in my experience, I think probably the AREs won't get too in the weeds on some of that, but in my experience, just from a sort of practice standpoint, you have to sort of sit with the building code as well as the sort of rehabilitation standards. So when I do this kind of work, I typically am using the IEBC, the Virginia version of the IEBC, the International Existing Building Code. And the existing building code allows for different levels of modification and also gives you specific language that tells you sort of when and how things have to or don't have to be brought up to certain codes, especially in historic buildings. So, if you can demonstrate sort of a really important building with certain sort of historical cultural value, the existing building code will let you get out of a lot of different components. There's sort of what the code will allow, and then there's sort of what we should be doing as designers. So it's just really, I enjoy this kind of work and also pull my hair out some days too, because it's this constant sort of push and pull and negotiation between what the building is, what the client might want, what the architecture might want, which is maybe separate of those two things, kind of what the urban context might be, what the code will allow you to do. So, for example, I mentioned that project down in Danville. We wanted to make it accessible. It's going to be a mixed use building, a few apartments upstairs and down, as well as a restaurant. A lot of these old buildings, especially the warehouses, the first floor sits 3 feet above the building grade because you could back the truck up or the train. So, right away you have an immediate accessibility problem because all these buildings are designed to be 3 foot or so above the grade so that you could back a big truck up to it. We happened to sort of negotiate that. We were able to make the case for the historic part. We maintained all the original facades, and there was a small little courtyard where a building used to be between. And we actually used that courtyard and kind of came into the middle of the building. So we put all our ADA stuff and ramp and sloped walk and all of those things kind of into that space, which allowed us to go to the tax credit and historic review folks and say, hey, look, we're going to a great means to preserve the facades of this building. And we're going to use the sort of interior elements. So there is a bit of negotiation. I mean, we do, I think, owe it to equity to make our buildings as accessible as we can, to not just, in my personal opinion, not to just use the code if it'll let's say you can make an inaccessible building to do it, but to sort of balance. So I would say, in my experience, it's hard to just say you don't have to do ADA or you do have to do ADA, because it's so much depends on the building, the context, the code, the change of use, all of those kinds of things, and different types of uses and different levels of renovation will trigger slightly different sort of parts of the code to where you do or you don't have to, make those changes. Change of use often results in a little bit more code requirements. There's a reason why you go to some old restaurant in an old town and it's been there for 50 years and it's got a step out front and the bathroom is inaccessible. It's because it's never had to do a renovation. It's never had to go through a change of use. So they've never had to sort of bring that up to code. As soon as they were to do some serious renovation, or if they were to change that use from a restaurant to something else, it would pretty much trigger a more strict reading of the code. So that's a long-winded way to say your answer will probably vary.
Yeah. No, I understand. It makes sense though. It's just when I think about restoration, I keep thinking like you have to restore to original form or shape and form. And it's just struck me like, most of them are not in code. So are we gonna force to just back to the same day, or
I think that's probably, you're going to put it back kind of like it was, and imagine maybe you visited some historic sites. They've usually found a way off, not on the primary facade, to make a ramp or to make a small lift or to allow, some
I see.
ameliorative measures that make something, in one small, less important corner, they made one accessible bathroom, right? They made sure that the doors were on automatic openers, so you don't need the clearances. So, I think there's ways to sort of negotiate, and most municipalities, I think, they're not going to tell you to go to Mount Vernon or Monticello or one of these sort of, 200-year-old really important old white guy buildings and say you got to put a concrete ADA ramp on the front of it. So it really is this sort of negotiation, and then it does depend. A restoration you would track one way, rehabilitation you would track another. So it's a little bit of choose your own adventure depending on what you're trying to do. So it makes it fun, but also hard to answer in a straightforward way.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Other questions?
Going once, going twice.
Fine. I'll pull a couple from the chat while folks are thinking. This one I just see. Can you speak a little about architectural fees? It seems like the designer will need to go through great means of discovery. Good question. Specifically in tax credit kind of work, there are folks often trained with an architecture degree who are sort of have drifted into tax credit consulting, whose job is to sort of help prepare some of this documentation. In my experience, some clients take on the tax credit documentation themselves because they want to have ownership of it and they want to save the dollars and cents. That said, I know when I do a tax credit project that I have to make these other drawing sets during schematic design, and that I'm going to be doing more research and I'm going to be kind of negotiating and having these extra meetings. And so it's, just like you would do your homework maybe before you write a fee proposal to understand the zoning environment or the sort of building code environment, or you'd want to sort of understand the kind of how a project might play out, like there's a board that reviews these things, there's a committee who's designing. So all those things that might normally make your ears perk up and you think that's probably going to take a little more time or require a little more energy on my part, then you should be adjusting your fees accordingly. So this would be a similar, you should probably be bumping your fees up a little bit for this level of, anytime I have to deal with historic review boards or those extra layers of review, negotiation, and revision. I just tell clients look, this is a more complicated process and the fees reflect what I think it's will cost to do that additional level of work that might not be the case for new construction or might not be the case in some other project. So good question. Let's see, scrolling. See some conversating happening. How do incentives work for federal buildings owned by federal or state agencies? Are those projects more smoothly? I'm not sure that the federal government will give itself tax credits. So these are typically sort of private developer, private kinds of things. I wonder if it's a good question, and I don't have the answer. Like, could the state of Virginia be renovating a school and apply for tax credits to the federal? I think it probably not, because it's really designed based on kind of the tax liability and those things. So I'm not sure sort of a government entity can give tax credits to some other government entity. It's just like borrowing money, like it would be, because it's already coming from the government. Like, why go through the work if the states, why would the state ask for money back from its own coffers, because it's the one coughing up the state? So there's probably some language in the many documents on that explain that a little bit more, but I don't, my guess is that these are more sort of for private kinds of projects, not for government buildings being renovated by the government.
Yeah, my legal spidey senses say you're right there, Kevin. We've got one more hand up.
Okay, go ahead, hand up.
Andrea.
Yeah, thanks. This was very helpful. I always feel like I have to go back and remind myself of these categories.
Yeah, me too, still.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. That's good to know. I just have kind of a question. Let me know if I'm interpreting this correctly. So in the question, it's a farmhouse that's being restored to its kind of original condition, right? But it's being used as, say, a museum, right? So it's not really being used as a home. So my question is, am I understanding it correctly? It doesn't really have so much to do with the use that's involved, but so much as the major, I guess, the physical components are being restored. And then also too, in that kind of a project, you would also be, of course, including, restrooms, public restrooms, and things that wouldn't appear in the a household. So my understanding is that you're just taking kind of the general bones of the structure, and it's about kind of just not the use, but the physical rehabilitation. Is that correct?
I think that's probably I would say that's a reasonable sort of interpretation and extrapolation from things. That yes, and this one in front of us is a good example, right? It was a house here on campus. Now it's used for small exhibitions and sort of small conference gatherings. So they took the old parlor rooms and now that's an exhibition room. So it's more, so in that case, the windows, the floors, the proportions of the walls, the trim, all that stuff is kind of, is the contributing historic elements. It just so happens that instead of sitting around talking about the news of the day, after a fancy dinner, you're going to a small meeting or something like that. So it really, and there's a whole other sort of academic critique about these kinds of programs, because they tend to only deal with the tangible sort of object, like the building as an object, and it might ignore sort of other things that might give something value. So for example, I did a little bit of research and writing on the Astor Gates, who's an artist, and he's an urban planner and potter, and sort of does everything in South Side of Chicago. And, he lives and works in a now predominantly African-American neighborhood, which has been that way since the 50s. A lot of the buildings there were built sort of in the 20s by German immigrants. So it's like you can look at the buildings and say, we're going to preserve from the 20s because of the architecture, because of the molding, because of the German influence, because of those things. But then are you then completely ignoring the sort of 50 or 60 years of a different cultural history that has less to do with like the particular stuff of the building and more to do with kind of the culture of the people, their histories, their stories? So that it's a little sort of side adjacent, and this is way beyond ARE. This is like total kind of academic nerddom, like critique of these things. So the preservationists, they're looking at like molding, and I've argued over Muntin profiles, like 1/8 of an inch on a Muntin on a window with a tax credit person. Like, really, can you tell me the difference between 7/8 and 3/4 when you're 100 feet away? I don't think you can. So it is interesting. So if I leaned a little bit on in that sort of bank example on keep the bank, that was just maybe trying to simplify so it'd be a little memorable. But it's not necessarily a bank. I would agree with your interpretation that it's largely about sort of the bones, the sort of just the architecture, the sort of proportions, the fenestration, the doors, the ceiling heights, work, the proportions of rooms really matter. So we go in and remove drop ceilings from the 70s in order to bring the proportion back up to the taller ceiling height from 100 years ago. And then we put in an exposed duct instead of concealing. So those are the things that really is the kind of, it's more the body of the building, maybe less the soul.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, thanks. You.
Good question. I like these discussion things because we get to get a little nuanced. So in this vein of thinking, would replacing the windows with double pane energy compliant, but still aesthetically appropriate, be considered low level rehabilitation? I missed sort of the conversation about that windows and sort of environmental performance and things do come up a lot in this kind of work. So I'll just speak a little bit about what I think was happening in some of the chat up and down this evening is like, to what degree should we or are we required to sort of introduce more thermally performing elements? In my experience, the windows, you can do double paned and you can do thermally broken, not when you're restoring the old wood thing, but if you're replacing in kind, then you just have to make sure you have to show a lot of detail. Your brick mold has to be the same, the Muntin profile. You have to show that the sash and the frame and the check rail and all those things are sort of match the historic condition. And you can do sort of replacement windows. And then you can put in sort of a thermally broken, aluminum clad window that looks historic. But this building we're looking at has, 6/6 windows. I can't come in and propose a 9/3 or a 1/1. I have to come back with 6/6. If those original windows weren't there, like they are often not there on a lot of you go into an old brick building that's been boarded up or something and all the windows are gone or broken, then we sort of try to put back based on whatever limited knowledge we have. But that same brick building, you typically, if it had brick walls exposed on the inside, guess what? You got to leave those. You can't come in and insulate even if you wanted to. Because that would change the character of the building. Similarly, if you had a more commercially oriented 100-year-old building that had plaster walls and your client's like, people love those brick lofts and they want to live in that cool industrial thing, that building, you have to keep it as a painted plaster surface or drywall. So, it's really about sort of the character of the building as defined by its materials and proportions and details and things like that. So it's like I said, it's an interesting thing to navigate. There is this give and take, the standards are there for interpretation and to provide guidelines. They're not prescriptive. They don't tell you have to do this because it's really this negotiation. And on these kinds of projects, it's, I'm going to do these 10 things to preserve and restore certain contributing parts. And because I know I got to go in and ask for a new fire stair, because I know I need to make the building safer. So it's like there's this negotiation. So it's like, I'm going to give you these 10 things because I want this one thing back. So it depends a lot on sort of the reviewers and the sort of conversation with those folks. And then you have to sort of make sure it gets built in the right way based on what you draw. And with that, I will say good night and get licensed and high fives all around. Thanks.